All right, so it said there are two kinds of beekeeping talks. They're the kind that make you a better beekeeper, and there are the kind that don't. And this is firmly in the latter. I do talks on how to get started with beekeeping, but this one is more focused on the bee side of things. So this isn't how we make honey, this is how they make honey. So my name's Sean. I'm an apprentice beekeeper in the Texas Master Beekeeper Program. I'm working on my certification to become a master. I've got a beekeeping business called Beemocracy where we do leases and art and sell honey. And I'm the VP of my local beekeeping club in Williamson County. So I love bees and I love talking about bees, and my wife is tired of hearing about it, so here we are. So, in my opinion, the colony can be best thought of as a factory whose inputs are nectar, which is basically sugar water, and pollen, which is protein. And the finished product, as far as they're concerned, is honey. And the honeybee is quite aptly named because they're really good at making honey. There are so many kinds of bees, but the kind of bee that we put in boxes is the European honeybee, because what it does is it just overproduces like crazy. It makes way more than it can actually probably use because it has gotten very efficient at it. And as beekeepers, that means we can take a little bit and they still survive through the winter, especially down here where it's not very harsh. The whole reason they make their honey is to serve as fuel to keep themselves hot enough to survive the winters when there is no nectar out there. They're the very industrious creature that actually stores up for winter and then survives because of that extra work. So, this is the honeybee. Honey is carious, but actually the Latin name is Apis mellifera, which means carrier of honey. Apis means bee, mellifera means honey carrier. And the food goes in right there, and you may be wondering, but the honey comes out right there too. Honey, they swallow nectar, they do some stuff we'll talk about in a bit, and out comes honey. Also, if you were wondering, this is the part where they get you, so avoid this part of the bee is the danger zone. They are what I would call a democratic creature. So we have the queen in the hive, right? And everyone thinks the queen is in charge. The queen is not in charge. She is there purely to make eggs all day long. She lays up to 2,000 eggs in a single day. And she's climbing around on the comb all the time, and there's this pack of workers that push her around in a circle and just guide her to empty cells where she can deposit an egg, maybe eat a little bit, they'll feed her directly. If she defecates, they'll clean it up. She's the only one that gets to poop in the hive. And then we have, I'll go over to the drones, they're the boys. So queen is a girl, drones are boys. They don't do anything. They don't clean, they don't go out and get food. Sometimes they don't even go get the food themselves, they just beg from their sisters to feed them. They just kind of walk up to their sisters and say, feed me, feed me. They are really, really big, they eat all day, and then they go out and mate, and they come home and they eat all night. So that's pretty much their whole deal. Everything else is done by the workers. As soon as they pop out as a baby, they get to work. Their first job is to clean. They go around and they kind of sweep up the hive and carry dead bees outside, should they be stuck in the hive, little bits of bee. After they get a little bit older, they start nursing. And that consists of going around and getting a little bit of pollen and feeding themselves, and a little bit of honey from the honey stores and feeding themselves. And then they have these things in their head which excrete something called royal jelly. And they walk over to the babies, which are little larvae hanging out of the cells, and they just spit royal jelly into the cells out of their heads. And that's how they nurse the babies, and they might clean them a little bit and stuff like that, and tend to them. After they, actually before that, they're builders. So they eat honey, and they convert it into wax and build up the, oh, we have a cat. Build up the hive and build it. Then their next job is to be a guard, where they hang out and defend the hive, keep other wasps out, keep ants out, keep beetles out, all that. Then their last job, which is the most dangerous, is to go out and forage and actually get the nectar that's going to come back and the pollen that's going to come back, and late stage water, because water is the most dangerous thing a bee can do, because you're hovering next to a pond or something and frogs want to eat you and things like that. So they save that for last because those bees are a bit disposable. Our vocab word down here for that whole thing is temporal polytheism, not polytheism. They don't worship many gods. They have many jobs. So polytheism means that throughout their life, they progress through this series of jobs. The other interesting thing is that if for whatever reason all the foragers got wiped out, the hive would actually be able to sense that, and they would shift some of their workforce early and start, early is over here for you, and they would start doing the foraging sooner than later. And conversely, if they were to lose all their nurse bees for whatever reason, they can actually go back in time and start nursing again, should they need to.
Are you going to talk about wax?
I will. Yeah, there's a whole slide on wax. All right, so bee communication. They actually talk to each other in a myriad of ways. They touch each other with their antennae, and they can kind of feel each other dancing, which is the other thing, if you've ever heard of the waggle dance. That's actually how they communicate where resources are, and I'll talk a bit more about how that works. They smell each other, so they actually talk to each other by spewing out smells. Pheromones is what we call them. So there are a whole bunch of those, and I'll talk about those. And then trophallaxis, this word here is a fancy word for spitting in each other's mouths. And this is actually the way they talk to each other. They will walk up and they'll link tongues with each other, and they actually transfer a bit of spit back and forth. And when they do that, it's transferring information about the health of the hive. If one of the bees has a lot of sugar in her belly, the other one's going to sense that, oh, there's a lot of sugar in the hive. There are also pheromones that they're passing back and forth when they do that. There's also microbiome that they're passing back and forth. So their gut bacteria that helps them digest is actually being passed to the younger bees by the older bees and propagating through that symbiosis as well. And then fun fact, they're actually right-handed like we are. They've done tests on bees where they actually like hold one of their antennae down and they can't like coordinate themselves as well as usual. And I don't know how somebody even thought to do that, but scientists. So, the waggle dance. So this is how they actually tell other bees where flowers are. And humans have spent so much time staring at bees that we've actually decoded how the dance works. There was this man in the 1950s, and I'm going to kind of skip around this video a little bit, named Karl von Frisch. And he sat there in his lederhosen next to beehives. So you already know he's a little bit crazy, but beekeepers are crazy. And he would paint bees, and he would follow them and see where they went, and he would watch them and see what they did. And, oh no, go back. We're still talking about Karl. You get this, you get these people with paintbrushes, and they're out here dotting all these bees so they can follow them around, and they've got an egg sugar and a bee sugar, and then they watch and they come back to the hive, and they do this. They wiggle, and then they come back and they wiggle again. And they wiggle in a direction. And the direction is based on where the sun is throughout the day. So as the sun is moving across the sky, their wiggle direction within the hive based on gravity has to adjust a little bit. But depending on how far they wiggle and the direction they wiggle, other bees are then able to follow them to the flowers. So when a bee finds a flower, or a Coke can, or whatever, she actually goes back and tells her other sisters how good it is. And based on how intensely she's dancing and the direction, the other bees will get recruited to go to that flower. And then they'll come back and they'll dance. And it's this feedback loop. So if it's a good flower, someone goes out and dances and comes back and people see it, and they go back and they come back in the dance. And as the flower gets depleted, they dance less. And fewer bees get recruited to the flower. So it like automatically adjusts itself based on this throughout the hive process that's happening. So I think that's really just fascinating how they are able to en masse like have this collective consciousness. In fact, the hive is a superorganism. The individual bees are like the cells of the body. The hive is like the skeleton. And then the whole thing acts as a big brain and is able to, within the radius of the hive, it's able to exploit the resources that are the most at any given point in the day. Like one flower may be producing differently than another at a different time of the day, and they're able to coordinate themselves and get to the right one at the right time. So other pheromones they have, there's one called the queen mandibular pheromone, which is produced only by the queen. And it basically lets the hive know that the queen is alive. So as the queen is doing her thing, she's laying eggs, and they're the retinue that's following her around, they're always kind of just touching her and sniffing her and licking her. And as they're doing that, they get the pheromone. And then they rotate out. It's not always the same bees in the retinue. So they go out and they do the thing where they kiss their sisters and their brothers. And they're passing that pheromone throughout the hive, and it spreads into the hive. So everybody knows, oh, the queen's here. Even if they haven't touched the queen, they've touched someone who touched someone who touched someone who touched someone who touched the queen, so they know it's good. As soon as the queen dies, for whatever reason, within an hour the hive is aware, and it's reacting to that, trying to produce a new queen as fast as it can. Because without the queen, they can't keep making babies. The other women in the hive are not fertile. They can only make drones, which not so great. The other pheromone they make is the alarm pheromone. I'm quite aware of this one because every time they sting you, they actually spray some alarm pheromone on you, which tells their sisters to come attack you too. Yeah. So if you get stung in one spot, you want to get that stinger off because it's spraying pheromone off. So if you get stung, scratch it off as quick as you can, because it's actually still pumping venom into you as well. Because the stinger gets ripped out, it's got the venom sac, and it's going pump, 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 and it's getting venom, so you want to scratch it off. It does hurt a little bit. And the other thing is that my bee suit, it's constantly got bees attacking it. It's stacking up the pheromone over time, so they hate me. Like I walk out there and they can smell me coming, so I have to wash my bee suit. If I don't, they're actually angry at me before anything ever starts. And then the last one is my favorite thing. This is like, I don't know why I think this is the coolest thing, but the Nasanov pheromone. This is how bees, and I've got a video of this one, tell their sisters to come home. So when I put new bees into a hive, or I open the hive, or I move stuff around, I can actually watch bees do this. And I think it's just really fun that I can understand exactly what they're saying. And it's gonna get to a spot here in a second, and it's gonna show, see this bee sticking its butt in the air? That little white spot right there on its butt is the Nasanov gland. And she's fanning her wings. White spot. And what she's doing is spraying this pheromone into the air that says to the sisters, this is where home is. So if the bees ever get lost, you can watch them do this, and they're calling everybody back to the house. If you, for instance, dumped a bunch of bees on the ground and you dropped a box, and that really pisses them off. So this is called Nasanoving. It was discovered by some Russian guy named Nasanov. And I just like able to read my bees and know what they're saying sometimes. All right, so this is what they do when they get sugar. So they can go up to 5 miles in a circle around their hive, but they don't want to go that far. They'll usually go about a mile, but they can go really far. And they will find the spot that they can get the most sugar from, because there's sugar everywhere, but they want the best spot, so they're going to advertise the best. And then flower fidelity. So this is an agreement bees have with flowers. As an individual bee, a bee is going to decide, I'm a daisy bee, or I'm a bluebonnet bee, and they only want to visit that one kind of flower. So within the hive, they're going to have a flower, many bees for every kind of flower. But the bees have agreed with the flowers, if I stick to one kind and I go, I'll be fertilizing the other ones of your type. So over the millions of years, bees and flowers have kind of like negotiated this, like, okay, you bees, you stick to me, one kind, and I'll give you the sugar. And the flowers produce the sugar for the bees. They don't need to make nectar. They do that to get the bees to come. It's advertising. Because they want their pollen to be moved around. The bees want payment for this. The bees kind of want the pollen too, but they also want that sugar. They need the sugar. So then they get it, they go home, they dance, And the forager bees actually spit it out as quick as they can because they know where the flowers are. And there's actually little catcher bees in the hive that are just kind of waiting. And their job is to meet the foragers when they come in, suck it all out of their gut, and then bring it into the hive and find a cell to put it in. Because the foragers, their whole job is fly, 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 fly. Because they know where stuff is, and then the younger bees, they'll come in and store it.
So,
Yes.
if, so is a hive dedicated to a type of flower?
No.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
then how
individual
does
bees.
one, okay, so if I'm a daisy bee and he's a bluebonnet bee,
Yeah.
then how does, and I'm come in and I do my waggle dance, how do they waggle that it's a daisy that they're waggling about?
Yeah, so they're not as specific in that regard, but once they start hitting a daisy, they're gonna go hit daisy. So the foragers really are the more fidelity ones. So the ones inside, I'll back up. Bees have personalities. Some of them are explorers. Some of them are followers. So the explorers are gonna be the ones that have the flower fidelity. Because they just like to find stuff. They go out and they just hunt flowers and they come back and tell each other. And then there's other ones that are just kind of hanging out waiting for someone to tell them what to do. And then they'll talk to a daisy bee or a bluebonnet bee and go help.
Oh,
But then they'll hit it a lot. You know, they're doing that whole batch. Yeah, thanks for the question. So that's foraging. So these are things that make them really good at foraging. You are probably aware bees have these two huge eyes that are covered in facets, and their eyes are shifted towards the purples. So they cannot actually see the color red. So if I'm ever working my bees at night, I'll put a red light on my hat and I'll go out there, and they don't realize I'm messing with them because to them it's just black. However, they see all this extra ultraviolet stuff, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a sec. They've also got this intense sense of smell on their antenna. They use that to detect flower odors. They also can taste with their feet. So when they land on a flower, they can tell how sweet the flower is before they ever stick their tongue out. And it's actually their feet hitting the nectar that triggers their tongue to blah, blah, blah. And they've done tests with that on bees where they put them in little restraints and they like put increasing amounts of sugar on their feet until their tongues come out. So they've actually like dialed in the amount of sugar that bees would prefer, which is almost any amount of sugar. They love sugar. Their tongue itself is about 6.5 millimeters, and I've got some pictures of these long little guys. They're really good at licking down into flowers. Obviously you've seen flowers with the deep cups full of nectar before. And then, I'm sure you've seen bees with those pollen buckets on their legs. Totally not an accident. They've got a specific structure on their back leg that is engineered to store as much pollen as they can. I'll show you some pictures of those as well. They're called corpiculi. I love the Latin. So this is what a human sees when we look at these different kinds of flowers. They all look yellow to us. Yellow flower, yellow flower, yellow flower. But to a bee with the ultraviolet, there's all these extra clues that the flowers have put on there for the bees. And you'll notice that in the middle of all the flowers, it almost looks like a target. And again, for the bees, they, from a distance, this is what they're seeing. So they're basically getting this landing zone of come right in here. And because they have the facets on their eyes, it's a little bit more broken down. So this would be human vision, human ultraviolet vision. That's what the bee gets. They've got kind of a pixelated version of the world. But they do have a very wide field of vision. They can almost see, their eyes are on the side of their head and they're very round and wide. So they get this panoramic globe-like look as they're flying around. These are the tongues in action. These are some pictures I took in my backyard. This is a bee licking out of my bird feeder, bird bath. And that's one over on a flower hanging out. I just think they're really cute. And then, of course, you can see the really, really big eyes. The other fun note is that they've actually got 5 eyes. They've got the 2 on the side. And then you see this little dot right there, that's one of the other 3 eyes. They've got 3 on top of their head called ocelli. And they don't see very well out of those. Those are mostly used to orient themselves in flight. They see differences in darkness and lightness. So they use those almost like an altimeter on an airplane to go on tipping and to reorient themselves. The other fun thing about those eyes is they don't go directly through the brain because the bee's wings beat so quickly that they can't send enough signals to their wings to tell them to beat that fast and to fix problems in flight. So those three eyes actually route through the brain, but then around the side of it, the big eyes go through like a lot more processing. Those ones skip a lot of processing so that they can tell the wings what to do more quickly. And it's almost like a reflex action with the wings when they fly. It's not them saying beat, 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 beat. It's them saying, start beating, stop beating. This is a close-up of one of their legs, called the back legs. So each leg is actually different on the bee. The front leg is almost like an arm, a hand. It's got more ripping. It's got a little thing on it that's specifically cut to fit over their antenna so they can clean pollen off their antenna and get every little bit of pollen. The middle legs are strong and they're good for hanging on to stuff, and then the back legs have the pollen press and the pollen basket. They'll squeeze the pollen and get it tight and then brush it into these areas that are depressed, and then the fur kind of sticks into it. They'll mix it with a little bit of honey to make it stickier, nectar, pardon, and just get as much on there as they can. They're very greedy about it because they want it to feed their babies as well as the sugar. So here's some more of my photos of bees. So here is a bluebonnet bee, and you can tell because it's got bluebonnet pollen, which is actually red. If you never knew, I didn't until I kept bees, and then I was like, all these bluebonnet bees have red butts. And then this one over here, I was lucky enough to catch in flight, and you can see that she's just absolutely caked in pollen, also not an accident. They're very furry, and they're electrostatically charged to make the pollen stick to them. So they can bring even more back to the hive and dump it out in the hive and put that in cells. And then here you can see this one's got some on her antenna that she hasn't yet cleaned off with her little scooper. Oh, and also, I can tell this is a she because she's doing work. If you've ever seen a bee, it was probably a she. So there was this funny quote in the 1800s that according to the laws of aerodynamics, the bees cannot fly, but the bee doesn't know that, so it goes on flying anyway. And it was this French sarcastic mathematician who was trying to understand how bees flew, and he could not solve the math of how bees fly. So he just threw his French hands up in the air and said that as a joke. And then people thought he wasn't joking. They can fly, obviously. They figured it out with science at this point, and it has something to do with making microvortexes with their wings. They flap, and it makes like little tornadoes that they ride through the air, which is just nutty to me. They beat their wings at 200 times per second, which is 1,200 beats per minute. So your car, when it's revving, is like 3,000. These guys are just blasting. Like I said, they can't actually tell their wings to beat that fast, so they just tell their muscles in their thorax, which is what the wings are attached to, just vibrate and contract. And actually squeezes the whole thorax back and forth, and the wings just kind of get two motions on each squeeze because they're attached to it like a hinge. They can carry up to half their body weight at a time, which unfortunately is only 50 milligrams of cargo capacity, but pretty good. They'll get 100 flights or so in their lifetime. They will literally fly themselves to death as foragers. They go out and they come back, and they go out and they come back, and they run into stuff, and their wings get a little bit tattered. And one day, they're flying home with some water, and they just nosedive into the ground, and they just don't make it back to the hive, and that's the end of that forager. An individual forager might last 4 to 6 weeks if it's lucky. The queen will last 2 or 3 years. But the foragers have a rough life. They work hard. They, like I said, can go out 5 miles, but probably not. And they consume about 10 milligrams of fuel per hour. So before they leave, they get a little bit of honey in them, and then hopefully they find some nectar while they're out. And they can, when they're collecting it, they have like a cow, 2 stomachs, cows have 4. They have one in front where they hold the nectar, and then they have the actual one where they digest stuff. So when they're out collecting, they fill up their honey crop. And if they need to, they can sip out of it while they're flying and put it in the digestive system, but really they're trying to collect it and bring it home. And when they're coming into the hive, if the sunlight is right and you're crouched just down right, you can actually see the ones that have honey because they're translucent. They have taken in so much that they've grown, and you can see through their body the golden nectar through their skin as they're kind coming into land, which I think is just really beautiful as well. Unfortunately, no picture of that. So this is the production cycle of honey. So first, we collect the nectar, and we bring it home and spit into someone's mouth. And then there is this enzymatic process, and they basically digest the honey ahead of time. Because when they want it in the winter, they don't have time to digest. They just need that energy as quick as they can so that they can start vibrating and warm the hive up and get their eggs through the winter and get their queen through the winter and themselves through the winter. So as soon as they get it into the hive, they start digesting it in their own honey crops, and they're passing it around, and they're also evaporating. Because when the nectar comes in, it's very watery. And if you've ever left sugar water out, it gets gross. It gets mold in it, turns into beer sometimes if you're lucky, but usually it's mold. So what they do is they sweat all the water out of the honey nectar during the passing back and forth as they're just spitting it around back and forth. And then once it gets to a certain point, they put it in the cells and they start blowing wind on it, and that evaporates even more. Then once it is at the appropriate amount, which is about 20% water, they put a layer of wax over the top to store it for winter, and it's basically indefinite at that point how long it can last. And then winter time comes, that's when we eat, and it's purely there to provide heat. So honey's just bee vomit. Technically not. They don't ever digest it. It is spit. I'm okay with it at this point. So there's a couple enzymes that they add to the nectar, because the whole point is to make this as broken down as they can so it's quickly digestible in the wintertime. So there's something called invertase, which takes the sucrose, which is like the table sugar, and it turns into fructose and glucose, which are basic sugars. They've also got another one that breaks down big starches. And then this glucose oxidase takes the glucose and breaks it down and makes hydrogen peroxide, which makes the honey antimicrobial, in addition to it being just very low water content. Those are the kind of two things that make it as good as it is for as long as it is. They've actually pulled honey out of 2,000-year-old Egyptian tombs that still seems edible. I don't know who's doing that test. So we eat what we can and we hoard the rest. I don't know if you like bluebell, but I do. That's basically how bees do it. They don't really want to share it. They're very angry when I try to take it. That's why I wear my bee armor. Like I talked about, they reduce it down to 20% before they cap it over, and then it's good to go. Not a whole lot more to say. I got excited and said it already. All right, so how do they store it? I'm sure you all have seen honeycomb before. They have to build that, and they built that out of sugar. So in springtime, when a new hive is getting started, they go out and they get the sugar, and they don't really produce a lot of honey because they need to put somewhere to put the honey. So the younger bees, when they eat, they produce wax out of their bellies. They have 8 glands on their belly, which I'll show a picture of, and it comes out like that, like little scales off their bellies. And you can actually see this when you're looking at a hive at the right time of year. And they will take these with their legs and pull them off and pass them up to their mouth and chew the wax up and then spit it out and build a honeycomb. And the honeycomb is a multi-purpose storage. They put their food there, they put their babies there. So this is a picture of a really nice frame where on the top, and this is very consistent, they put the honey on top, and then they'll have their pollen. Then they've got some empty room here, and we can see these little dots. Those are eggs that the queen has laid in the cells. And then as we get closer towards the middle, we start getting larvae, which are the next stage as they develop. And these ones are actually floating in royal jelly. So this bee right here is probably spitting royal jelly into the cell. Then the next stage is called the pupa, which is just a bigger version. And at a certain point, the pupa get capped over as well to finish their metamorphosis. They're kind of like a butterfly where they turn into something prettier and better. The other fun thing about the larvae floating in their food. So they're on their sides floating in their food. And bees breathe through holes on the side of their body. So the babies are floating in their food. They can't breathe out of this side. They can only breathe out of this side, and they're just literally eating as fast as they can. And at this stage, they're floating in their food. So they can't poop, because that would be very bad. So their butt is not connected to their stomach yet. So as they're a larva, it's not until they're a pupa that they can poopa.
But if they're sealed in the thing, where does it go?
In there. So the whole time that they're in there,
Right.
they're consuming whatever food they had. They're not eating anymore because they're capped, so they probably pooped. But it's in the cell. So after the bee emerges, it eats its way out the top.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see this one is probably eating its way out right now. The worker bees will come back through and clean the cell out. But the cells get dirtier and dirtier over time. So when we first get our honeycomb, it's this beautiful white, and then the bees have dirty feet and the baby bees and all that. The cells get smaller with time because they build this layer of bee bits inside, and they also get blacker and grosser. So we have to rotate our hive out every once, our comb out every once in a while, scrape it off, melt it down, use it for bee products.
But if it's in nature,
In
who's
nature,
doing that? Do they just move? Do they just shift?
so in nature, there are scavengers of beehives called wax moths. So at a certain point, a beehive will just become non-viable and will die off.
Okay.
The wax moths will come in, they'll consume the wax, raise their babies, and then that cavity is good for another set of bees at some point probably, unless the tree falls down. So, all right, Hymenopteran resources, it's my HR joke. So the queen has the one job, which is make babies. So life cycle wise, the queen goes on one mating flight ever. As soon as she's born, she comes out of her little queen cell, and any other queen cells that are in the hive, she kills them immediately, because there can only be one. Her wings harden, and she goes out on a mating flight, and she'll mate with something like 20 drones on that one flight. Every one of the drones that mates with her, good job. It rips them in half and they die. So they've succeeded, I guess. And then she comes home, and she never leaves again. And she'll start laying eggs every day, 2,000 eggs a day, for 2 or 3 years, until she dies.
Just from that one experience?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she has a organ in her body that is able to store it all. Every time she lays an egg, she's able to choose whether or not to inseminate the egg. If she does, it becomes a girl, and it is one of her workers. If she does not, it becomes a drone, and it's a boy. The other girls, the workers, can only lay drones, because they never got inseminated. So if the queen dies, the first thing the hive is going to try to do is to make another queen. They have one chance, which is they can take an existing egg, and if they feed that egg nothing but royal jelly, it will turn into a queen. Normally what happens is they feed eggs royal jelly, and then 3 days they cut them off, and they turn into silly little workers. If a baby gets fed nothing but royal jelly, she turns into a queen. Same egg. But just that better diet makes her turn into a completely different expression of bee. So where was I on queens? Ah, yes. So the queen, while she's alive, she's got that queen mandibular pheromone that I talked about earlier. That actually suppresses the worker's desire to make eggs themselves. So only the queen will lay eggs. But if she's gone, the workers won't get that anymore, and they might start laying drones. Because if they can't make a queen, the hive has one chance to pass this genetic stuff on, and that's just mass-produce drones and try to get some drone influence out into the world. Ideally, they want their queen though, so this is like last-ditch workers make drones. If we're a beekeeper and we get to that point, that hive's dead. We've lost our hive. Inside the hive, they want to keep it about 95 degrees at all times. Winter, summer, everything. So during the summertime, they actually air condition the hive. They bring water in, they spit it, and then they blow wind over it and evaporate, and they make a swamp cooler. And they blow air out of the hive and make an air conditioner. And then in winter, they eat the honey and they vibrate. They unhook their wings from the muscles, and they make their thorax vibrate as if they were flying, and that produces heat. And they'll rotate themselves in and out of the cluster As they get cold, they move into the cluster to warm themselves back up, and they just hover over the brood, and they keep it as warm as they can all winter, so that it will survive. So this is a 2-year business cycle for a beehive. We've got January, January, January. As the pollen for spring comes in, that's the trigger for the hive to start building up for the year, because they know, oh, we've got resources, we can start doing the thing. And if we lay this over on top, we actually have what they're up to at the different points of the year. So at the beginning of the year, they're doing build up to get the force ahead of the nectar flow they need to have all their bees ready to go. They can't lag. They have to be ready when it comes, because the other bees will beat them. So they start reproducing, they build up their stuff. Summertime is about when we have our nectar flow here. So they're at max capacity, and they just start storing all the nectar. And then as it tapers off, that's when they start having to worry about wintertime, and then repeat the cycle. The other interesting thing is that they make different worker bees in the first half of the year and the second half of the year. In the first half of the year, they make ones that are really good at going out and foraging and exploring. In the wintertime, they make fatty bees, whose whole job is just be really good at storing energy from sugar and vibrating. And they last a lot longer. They get to last all winter long, so they're not that 6-week duration. So they live longer, that's great. The other thing they do this time of year is nobody's reproducing. So any drones that are left, they kick them out, and they die of exposure. So there's no reason to keep the drones around in the winter. We don't need them. Kick them out. They die. Sorry guys, they have a rough life. They have a pretty easy life. They have a rough life. It's both. Conflicted on drones. So, franchising. We gotta make more beehives. We've made our beehives successful. We want to expand into more beehives. So the whole point of the beehive is to make more beehives. Usually in the spring is when this happens, because that's when there's all the extra stuff around. And their trigger is, it feels really crowded in here. When the beehive is just so full of bees that there's just no more room for bees, that's when the queen decides, I'm gonna lay baby queens. And as soon as the baby queens are about to come out, the old queen and about half the workers will suck up as much honey as they can, and they'll leave. And they'll go out and they'll hang out on an eave or a branch, and they'll make what's called a bivouac, which is this big cluster of bees. And I told you about what the old queens are doing back there. So while the bees are hanging out in this cluster, they send out scout bees. And the scout bees are going out, and they're looking for little holes with about 40 liters of space, with pretty good temperature, and they'll walk around inside and measure it by walking the inside of it. And then they'll come back to the swarm, and they use the waggle dance again. And they say, over here, I found a pretty good house. Come check it out. Another scout might go check it out, and they'll say, I liked that one. They'll dance for it. And they'll vote. The scouts will vote based on who's deciding which house is best. They're kind of arguing. There's some back and forth. It takes a couple days sometimes for them to come to an agreement. And eventually they'll reach quorum, and the swarm cluster will pick up, and they'll en masse with the queen and all the other workers that were just hanging out, fly over, go to the new house, and just start building honeycomb, and that's their new home. And then from one beehive, we have 2 beehives every spring, hopefully. Sometimes more. Sometimes they'll swarm multiple times out of one hive in a season. Okay, we gotta have some security, physical security. So at the front of the beehive, they post guards. They're looking for people like me in white suits and bears. And as soon as they see one of those come up, they raise the alarm. They start spraying the alarm pheromone, and workers from inside come out and use their stingers for colony defense. They don't want to sting you when they're on flowers. They don't have anything to defend. If you poke them, they might sting you, but they're not out to sting you. If a bee lands on you, just let it be there. It's probably not there to sting you. They care when you're trying to take their honey. The other thing is that when a bee stings you, the stinger is barbed and it gets ripped out of their body, and it rips their guts out too, and it kills the bee. So they don't want to sting you because it kills them. So you don't really need to be afraid of bees unless you're next to a beehive, because they don't want to sting at all. It's like their last line of defense. So there's some things that bees work with. They've got some friends in the world. They've got flowers, which they've come to agreements with over millions of years. Flowers make the nectar for the bees. The bees do the job for the flowers, fertilizing them. They also go out to trees and they get sap from the trees and they use that to plug holes in their hive. So if there's a draft, they'll go out to a tree, get sap, and like fill the hole up. And propolis is another product of hives that we'll sometimes take. You can make a tincture out of propolis, and people think there's health benefits to that. So sometimes we're scraping that off the hives. It's really, really sticky, gross stuff. Whenever I'm working with the beehive, I come out just sticky, even if I didn't touch honey, because the whole thing is just covered in tree sap. And then there's a lot of microbiome interactions. They rely on bacteria in their guts just like we do to digest the honey. It's not just their enzymes, there's also symbiotic bacteria and fungi that help them with that whole process. And then the fermentation as well. When they have their pollen, they mix it with a little bit of honey and make something called bee bread that ferments a little bit and adds to its nutritional value. So the micro yeasts are helping them make their bee bread as well. It's not good for humans. It doesn't hurt us, it's not helpful. Not everything bees make is good for us. Bees also have a few threats besides me. There's this bug called the Varroa destructor mite, which is a very, very tiny bug that eats bees. It looks like a crab, and it crawls under their armor and it sucks their blood. And it makes them weak, and it makes them more susceptible to viruses and bacteria. So this is like the main threat to bees that I have to deal with as a beekeeper. I have to treat my bees twice a year for this one bug, because it adds such a virus load and bacteria load that it will make my hives weak and kill them, which I don't like. And then the other thing is pesticides. Bees are very sensitive to pesticides in the environment, so people spraying 2 miles away can affect my beehive. So there's no way I can say I have organic honey, because even if I don't treat my yard, the bees don't stay in my yard. And unfortunately, people use a lot of poison. And then bees, every business has its community service role, so we would not exist as humans if we didn't have bees doing our pollination. In fact, the US has this whole industry regarding bee pollination, where in the spring, Florida loads up semi-trucks full of bees, ships them across the USA to California, and the only reason almonds work in California is because of the Floridian bees that we send over there every year. They can't raise them all in California because it doesn't work out right, so we have this whole industry of moving bees around. And then also, they're kind of like the canary in the coal mine. If our bees are dying, there's probably something deeper afoot, and not a good spot to be. So that is my TED Talk, and I'm open to any questions you have about honey or bees or whatever, yeah.
I know that there was talk a while ago, it's been a while since I've kept up, about bees dying, like you were mentioning. Has that gotten better at all?
It has, and it hasn't. So there's colony collapse disorder was a thing for a while, and they didn't really know what was going on. They kind of have traced that down to the varroa mites and pesticides, and it was getting a lot better. And then there was this alert that came out this year that 50% of beehives have failed over the course of the year, which is consistent with what I've seen. I lost about half my hives. No explanation, just poof. So, yeah, it's a thing. You got a question?
I know some are bigger. Wasps are a little bit bigger, and hornets are the largest ones in the family.
It can definitely depend. There's actually thousands of species of bees and wasps and hornets and ants. They're all the same group, and I'm sure there are some bees that are huge, and there are some wasps that are gigantic, and then there's some that are tiny. I've seen little teeny bees like this big, and I've seen, that big. Yeah, they come in a range. Yeah. The bee we keep here in the U.S. though is a very specific bee. It's the European honeybee. There are other honeybees though. There are Asian honeybees and African honeybees. If you've ever heard of Africanized bees, they are an angry bee that came from Africa and has started getting into the genetics around here, and kind of an issue as well.
So honey itself, as a producer, I've heard that honey that has not been heat treated is better for you than honey that has.
Yeah.
Is it normal practice to heat treat honey? Like if I go to you to buy honey, how do I know if you heat treated it as opposed
Sure.
to if I go into HEB?
So there are honey labeling rules, which one of them is whether or not you've pasteurized the honey.
Okay.
So you can definitely check the label to see if they've called that out or not. There's also filtered, unfiltered. I personally try to keep it as raw as possible because I figure if somebody wants to heat it up, they can do that themselves.
So what's the difference between pasteurized and filtered?
Filter would be they ran it through a very fine filter and removed potentially some of the beneficial stuff because they filtered it too much. I like to run mine through a rough filter to get the bee legs out because there's always parts of bee in the process. So yeah, that's basically. And then the other thing you want to do is get your honey as local to you as you can because it's got the local pollens and stuff like that in it as well.
And also to that point, so I read the book Mad Honey, which talked about how honey from, what's that, rhododendrons and something else can actually be poisonous.
Yes.
And of course, there are honeys that are labeled, from orange flower, etc. What's the test that or do you have to run a test to know if you have these pollens in your honey? So not only that you can say this is orange blossom honey, but that you don't accidentally.
So you can send your honey to get genetically profiled, I'm sure, like they can actually figure out this is the pollens that are in it. What I think most people typically do is they say, I have a lot of tallow trees around, therefore I have tallow honey, because the bees again are gonna range where they range. And the old beekeepers will say that they know what kind of pollen it is by the color and all that. I'm not experienced enough to be able to do that. There are also trick pollens in some areas. In California, there's a fungus that tricks the bees into thinking it's a pollen and they bring it back home and it's completely worthless to them. It's fungal spores. And they happily fill their cells up with this red dust and it just wastes space.
But it doesn't hurt them.
Doesn't hurt them.
That's
There are,
a different story.
there are fungi that grow in the hive that do hurt them. There's something called chalk brood. There are all these diseases with nasty names like foul brood, chalk brood, yeah, what have you. Did you have any other bee questions over there?
No, thank you, sir.
No? Okay.
How much land do you need per hive? What's the?
So there is a maximum amount of hives you could stick in an area.
Okay.
But as an individual beekeeper, any amount of land will work. People keep them on the balcony of their New York apartment. So if you've got a backyard and you're willing to put up with it, you can do it. Would be my say on that. If you're like me and you've got 15 beehives, you need to start doing ag leases. So that's what I'm up to. My business now is to find people with a lot of land and say, I'll keep bees on your land and you get to get a tax break and I get some money from you and I get to keep all the honey.
How much land do you need for that tax break?
You need at least 6 acres, because 1 acre for the home site, and then you can get 5 to 20 as an ag exemption.
Okay. But you don't have to worry about the beehives competing with each other if they're too dense?
They commercially will put hundreds in a field while they're transporting them, and just on pallets. They palletize the bees, they'll put like 8 hives on a pallet, and then they'll just have 100 of them in the field. And I keep my bees 4 in a row, and they seem to be fine. There is a thing that will happen called robbing, where if a hive gets weak, other bees will sense it and they'll just go rob it blind and take it out. They'll take all the honey, they'll rip it apart, they'll fight the other bees. So that is a potential, but proximity isn't really the trigger, it's weakness. One hive with the other. Yes.
How'd you get into beekeeping?
I was gardening and my garden sucked. And I was like, how do I fix this? Well, if I got a beehive, so I did, I got 2, and my garden went crazy. It definitely worked. And then I realized I like keeping bees more than I like gardening. So I don't garden a lot anymore, but I do have a lot of beehives.
I've seen his garden, I can attest.
Yeah. That's awesome.
So yeah, I got sucked into the YouTube hole, and I made the mistake of deciding I wanted to keep bees around June of a couple years ago, and it turns out you have to do it in the spring. So I spent 9 months just churning through YouTube, watching everything I could about bees, became an expert before I ever had them, and then joined my local bee club, and now I'm VP of the bee club because I'm just obsessed. I just can't stop talking about them. I also make bee art, bee
What type of bee art? As in like paintings or, well, obviously your photographs were very good.
I do the photos. I also I make ridiculous
Wow.
bee art,
Okay.
like the queen bee, the worker bee, flower girl. I've got
Drones?
bee video. Of course, we've got BB-8. Oh, I've got Bee Granny. I love her. This is my bee business logo
Okay.
for Beemocracy.
So cute.
Yeah, I'm just super into bees. I do weird bee art. This is the beekeeper.
Keeping the humans.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah.
Got,
Butt napkin is my lord.
I've got my bee superhero. It's all kinds of stuff.
Human, I didn't believe in being.
This one's fun.
Yeah.
He's got commentary for you.
Yeah, what's up?
Our school is called the Bumblebees.
Oh, that's cool.
He goes to academy, so they're called the bumblebees.
Oh,
Do bumblebees produce honey?
not en masse. So a lot of bees produce honey, but not to the point that they store it. So, yeah, it's definitely not unique to honeybees, but they're the only ones that are like just going crazy with it.
Oh, it's gonna be
How do solitary bees survive the winter? They don't have like a colony generally eat.
Yeah, they just kind of hunker down with one, and do the best. The honeybee has a very specific way of doing it. They're the only one that's quite that industrious, I think.
Thanks for
Well,
coming,
thank
Rebecca.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope you learned something.
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
lots.
How many eyeballs does he have?
Yeah.
5. What color is
Yeah.
it?
Red.
Oh, it's easy when you know my count.
Yeah.
How do they communicate?
Well,